Okay, today we're going to talk about something called emotional honesty. And usually, when I hear people talk about emotional honesty, it is in the context of saying that people are not emotionally honest enough. But I'm going to make kind of the opposite point today because I think that we live in a culture where the highest moral currency, in fact, is authenticity, and emotional honesty is framed as a virtue. Honesty is transparency, and transparency is truth. And truth, we are told, heals. We are told this by therapists. We're told this by friends who think that that's what you're supposed to say because that's what a therapist might say. We're told this by self-help gurus and podcasters and YouTubers that you need to be authentic and honest with other people so that they can bear witness to your truth and so that you can experience the healing effects of being open. But this premise really begins to fracture when honesty becomes currency in a system that rewards performance over integrity. So we actually have, and I think this is the problem with saying that emotional honesty is a virtue or living in a culture in which the incentive structure rewards treating emotional honesty as a virtue. We have competing incentive structures because, on the one hand, people will say that you ought to be emotionally honest. And on the other hand, people want you to perform and expect you to perform and reward you for performing rather than being integrous or having integrity. And when the revelation of inner life is not protected, when it's not privatized, but harvested, then we get something like our modern day culture, where emotional disclosure is no longer human, but tactical and transactional, or worse, expected. So I want to examine this concept of emotional honesty. Where did it come from and how does it affect us? Not as a moral good, but as a strategic posture, one that may serve you or sabotage you, depending on the context. Because in a culture of visibility, that's inescapable. What you feel is actually less important than what your feelings can be used to mean, a positive sense or a negative one. So let's dive into a few of the primitives that constitute this concept that we have of emotional honesty. Like, what are the building blocks? When we think of authenticity or emotional honesty, like, what are the building blocks of that concept? So there is a book called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, 1956, by Irving Goffman, who argued that all social interaction involves a performance where you have the front stage and the backstage. And we manage impressions and we withhold signals and we curate affect. And this isn't deception, it's just survival. And what was once a theory of social psychology has become a foundation of digital culture. So social media is the new front stage. But unlike traditional performances, the curtain never drops. The self is always on. And within this permanent theater, sincerity is become a rehearsed act, basically. So the problem really is not honesty. The problem is that honesty is now legible. Honesty is now marketable. Honesty is now a currency with which we can transact. It's parsed for meaning. Now, once honesty becomes a currency, then it becomes contrived and performative. It becomes a proxy for something else. The expectation is not simply that you tell the truth, It's that you do so in a way that affirms the values of your chosen audience. So again, we have these competing incentive structures. One for you to be emotionally honest and one for you to be who I want you to be. Those two things can't coexist in the same linear incentive structure because they may diverge in principle. So that's the first building block of this concept of emotional honesty is the performance of sincerity that we get from this Goffman book. The second concept is more of a frame, which is the myth of safe disclosure. So we are trained to believe that vulnerability is relational and that it is kind of a glue between people, that the brave thing to do is always to open up. But this belief collapses when disclosure becomes a trap. So there's a great book called Cruel Optimism, 2011, by Lauren Berlant. And Berlant describes the affective structures that we cling to, even when they undermine us, where vulnerability is one such structure. So we are told that vulnerability leads to intimacy, but in practice, it often leads to exposure without safety. Emotional honesty becomes cruel when the system receiving it is indifferent, transactional, or exploitative. When your disclosure is not held, but stored and indexed and resurfaced, whether by an algorithm or a partner, whether by an HR manager or a therapist. In institutional settings, confession is not a bridge to understanding. It is a ledger entry. So we have these two initial primitives that we use to build the concept of emotional honesty. One is the performance of sincerity. One is the myth of safe disclosure. You can't really have a performative sincerity because that is the conflation of two incentive structures that are mutually exclusive. Second is that safe disclosure in an institutional context is a thing. It's not. Really, you have another instance of two conflicting incentive structures there. One is the well-being of the institution. One is the well-being of the self. And again, it's not that they can't coexist. It's that they may diverge. And to believe that they are one incentive structure or one system or that they align is an illusion. And then next, we have confession as compliance. So I know this is a controversial philosopher, but in the History of Sexuality, 1976, Michel Foucault, he identified confession as a mechanism of power, not because the context of confession mattered, but because the act itself made the subject legible, socially legible, relationally legible. And once you speak your truth, the system knows how to handle you. And what was once a sacred act becomes a disciplinary one. You are no longer opaque. You are known. And once you are known, you are easier to manage. Emotional honesty is not just self-expression. It is an entry into a system of interpretation, a system that converts your inner life into data for sorting and for correcting or for capitalizing. So how can we shift? So we've kind of looked at these three primitives that serve as building blocks for the concept of emotional honesty. The performance of sincerity or performative sincerity, which is kind of a paradox, a conflation of conflicting incentive structures. Then you have the myth of safe disclosure. Then you have confession as compliance. So what's the alternative to treating emotional honesty as a virtue? What's the alternative to the virtue of emotional honesty? Well, it is the strategic self, which is going to sound narcissistic and sociopathic and cold and inauthentic and inhuman. But what I'm trying to tell you is that the concept of emotional honesty is an inherited, conditioned concept that serves to manipulate people and is full of paradoxes and inconsistencies, and really is incentivize. What it does is it incentivizes us to air the public log of our inner monologue at all given times, because who we ever are is layers of more and less aligned versions of ourselves. Who we are at any given moment may be closer or further away from who we are at any other given moment. And so the concept of emotional honesty, rooted in this concept of authenticity, that I'm letting you know the real me, really relies on a concept of the real me that is unfounded and kind of unjustifiable. So rather than having an undesigned presentational or front side layer, right? Like going back to Irving Goffman's book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, going back to that front stage, right? So we can either have an undesigned version of ourselves that shows up there that's unrehearsed, that's uncurated, or we can have one that is curated and is designed and is something that is intentional and consensual. So the corrective to emotional honesty is not dishonesty, and I think that's the fallacy that people fall into. We think, well, if I'm not unfiltered, I'm dishonest. That's a false binary. Not even a binary. That frames it as a spectrum that's dishonest. Rather, what we want, instead of the kind of emotional honesty that our culture claims to treat as a virtue, instead of that, we have discretion. Not dishonesty, discretion. So opacity, as Edouard Glissant has argued, is a right. Not every truth must be legible. Not every feeling deserves exposure. Privacy is not a refusal to connect. It is the architecture of our integrity to choose when and how and to whom you are emotionally honest. This is not evasion. It's authorship. A refusal to let the logic of the confessional override the logic of the sovereign self. This is courage. There's courage in saying what you feel, but there's also equally courage in not needing to perform it, in knowing that emotional truth does not require external validation to be real. There's a powerful sense of strength that comes with this kind of practical reservation that you have, where you reserve a space just for yourself, for that emotional ledger, and you create distance between that and what other people get to see. Again, our culture will tell you that this is a dishonesty and sociopathic, but what it really is discreet. It's discreet and it's sovereign, and it's authorship, and it's exercising a private right to mental and emotional real estate that belongs to you. It is really a stance on private rights. So this isn't to close, this is not a rejection of vulnerability. This is rather a recontextualization of vulnerability. Emotional honesty in the wrong frame becomes liability. It invites misinterpretation and emotional surveillance and system-based containment. What begins as intimacy becomes infrastructure. This is very common in many contexts, quite honestly, but often is used as a mechanism of control, specifically in religious or spiritual contexts. Enforced or policed emotional honesty. And the true ethical move is not exposure for its own sake. The true ethical move is coherence. Because alignment between inner life and outer life, between inner posture and outer posture, without compulsory translation between the two, this is really powerful. and it's an experience worth cultivating in yourself. So protect your opacity. Protect your right not to be seen fully at all times. Not because you have something to hide, but because the truth deserves better than to be processed and systematized and controlled and enforced and policed and given immediate feedback to. You are not more real because you are exposed. You are not more trustworthy because you are legible. You are not more human for being harvested. You are more human for knowing when to close the curtain and when to step backstage.